obviously Montreal's been covered to death, but somebody asked this question the other night and we didn't get to it. You had Rick Rude turn up on Nitro the same night that he was on Raw because he'd done the tape show. I want to ask you about Rick Rude because he came back. He was quite physical in the role he was in the NWO. And he obviously sadly died in 1999, but there was a lot of stories that he was training to wrestle again and he wanted to come back. Can you share some memories of Rick Rude? And do you think, had things been different, he would have been able to wrestle again he would have got that comeback?
A little bit of history. I knew of, I didn't know Rick Rude when I was in high school or shortly out of high school, maybe in my early 20s, mid 20s. Before I broke into wrestling, Rick Rude came from the same city that I did. Rick Rude and I had mutual friends. Rick Rude was kind of famous for being a badass in Minneapolis. He was a legitimate badass. And I had friends. We would go to the bars where we knew, like Hawk and Animal, before they broke into wrestling. They were bouncers at a place called Grandma B's, which was a pretty tough bar in a part of Minneapolis. And me and my friends would go there just to watch them beat the out of people. And Rick Rude was like one of the most exciting people to watch at a bar. So I was very well aware of Rick, even though I didn't really know him. And then when I came to work as an announcer in WCW, because Rick was from Minneapolis and we had a lot of mutual friends, we became, we clicked right away. We would drive to TV tapings together a couple times. We hung out. So when it was time for Rick Rude to come back to WCW, Rick called me and said, hey, I'd like to come back. I said, great. But here's the problem with Rick Rude. Rick Rude took advantage of a Lloyd's of London policy, like a lot of wrestlers did at that time. We're talking back in the early 80s when Lloyd's of London would write $2 million insurance policies on professional wrestlers. And if they got hurt and they couldn't work ever again, they'd get a huge check. And wrestlers are pretty well known for exploiting and taking advantage of certain things. And Rick was one of them. Rick hurt his back, legitimately, cashed in his Lloyd's of London policy, which is where he, when he ended up going back to WWF as a manager. But when you take the money from Lloyd's of London back then, and they write you a check because you are no longer able to pursue your professional career, you can't pursue your professional career ever again. If you do, they're going to come back and sue you for the money that they paid you in your insurance policy. And I knew that. I had experience with that. So when Rick called me and said, hey, is there a room for me? That was, because actually Rick Rude was the one that called me. The first person to call me as the result of the Montreal screw job was Rick Rude. I was sitting in my home on a Sunday night. I wasn't watching the pay-per-view. I didn't give a I had no idea what was going on. Rick Rude called me in my home, and he told me everything that went down. He was so pissed off at Vince McMahon. He said, Eric, is there any chance I can come back to WCW? I said, sure, absolutely, Rick. We're friends. Get on a plane, come back. We'll figure it out. I'll have you on TV next week if you're contractually available. And he did. So Rick came back to WCW to get away from Vince because he was pissed at Vince because of what he did to Bret Hart. And then when he got to WCW, all of a sudden Rick wanted to wrestle again. I said, well, Rick, you can't. It's the Lloyd's of London policy. You can't. That's not possible. Yeah, but this is Rick telling me. Yeah, but Eric, if you paid off Lloyd's of London, so they don't sue me, I can wrestle again. I said, Rick, I like you and we're friends, but I can't do that. I can't go to my boss and say I'm going to write a $500,000 check to pay off an insurance policy that you cashed in that isn't real. I can't do it. And Rick became very frustrated as a result of that. And this is a story I haven't told too much. I mentioned it, but When Rick died, Rick was very frustrated, and he was doing a lot of drugs and things that he shouldn't have been doing, and that's why he died. I went to his funeral because we were friends, and when I got to his funeral, Rick's sister read me the riot act. She blamed me for Rick Rude overdosing on drugs because he was so frustrated that he couldn't get back in the ring and perform again. Like, it was my fault. And I haven't been to a wrestling funeral since because I felt so horrible that I'm not sure if my wife was with me or not, but I left. I walked out before the service because I didn't want to be the cause of a scene. And I understand now as I've gotten older and, more mature, I understand she was hurt. She was, she was devastated. When you hurt that bad, you want to lash out at anybody you think deserves it, even if it's not rational. And I just happened to be that guy because Rick was complaining to his friends and his family, "Oh, Bischoff won't pay off my insurance policy. If he would, I could get back in the ring." And because he saw all of his friends around him doing so well. The NWO was hot, and Rick was such a talented dude. He was so amazing. He knew in his head, in his heart, that he could have a tremendous amount to contribute. But because the freaking insurance policy that he cashed a couple of years before, it prevented him from doing it. And because I wasn't willing, in Rick's mind, oh, he works for Ted Turner. He's got Ted Turner's money. He can write a check. He can do whatever he wants to do. Well, that's not true. But it was true in Rick's mind. And he communicated that to his friends and his family. So then when I went to his wedding, I was the bad guy. I was the one that caused him, or was partly responsible for him ODing. That's the Rick Rude story.
Let's talk about sticking to 1999. There was two big WWF debuts that were former WCW guys: the Giant, Paul White, and then Chris Jericho. At the time, did you want to keep them? Did you care about keeping them? There's a lot of TV time invested in both of them in different ways. How were you feeling about each of them?
Chris Jericho, I really wanted to keep. I worked pretty hard to keep Chris, but Chris was and is a really smart. He's an amazing performer. How many times has he reinvented his character? He changes his character and reinvents it in a good way, like I changed my socks. It's like crazy. But Chris, I think, understood that because we were so deep from the top down, Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Roddy Piper, Sting, Lex Luger, there were so many names at the top that a guy like Chris Jericho, who was still early in his career, it was going to be a minute before he was going to be able to break through to that upper level, right? And Chris had so much confidence in himself and drive and ambition and creativity that he was impatient. And he thought, fuck it, if I can't get that opportunity here, I'm going to go somewhere else. Now, I offered Chris a lot of money to stay. I really bent over backwards to try to keep him. But Chris wasn't as interested in the money as he was the opportunity to grow as a character. So Chris left, and that one stung because I tried really hard.
Off the back of that, though, do you think if Chris had stayed in 1990, if he'd taken the deal you'd given him, do you think there would have been big opportunities for him to grow as a character?
No, he made the right decision. To be very honest, he was absolutely correct in making the decision he did, especially in 1999, because WCW was a cluster. Is cluster a word in the UK? Yeah. Well, if it's not, it should be, and it is now. But it was a mess. And Chris saw that as well. Creatively, we had lost direction. There was a lot of things going on internally. Chris might not have been aware of, but he saw the result of it. And he bet on himself, and he went to WWE. Paul White, the Giant, that's a little bit of a different story. Paul came to me whatever year it was, I don't remember, and said, "Hey, boss, I got an offer from WWE for $1 million a year, downside guarantee. Should we talk business?" Good luck to you, Paul. And seriously, and I like Paul, and I still like Paul. We're friends. But there was no way I could justify that kind of money for Paul White because I had worked with Paul White for a couple of years at that point. We broke Paul White into the wrestling business. We made him a star. We showcased him with Hulk Hogan. We put him in a monster truck, for God's sake. Better does it get than that?
How did the monster trucks get on the top of the building? There were so many questions.
I don't even remember. I had nothing to do with that part of it. I don't even remember. But I knew that Paul, because Paul, being as big as Paul was, and this is going to get into a little bit of like wrestling psychology and what you have to think about as a writer or a producer or even as a talent, is if Kenny and I are in a wrestling program, he's the heel and I'm the baby face. The only way you're going to care about that is if you like this character, you like me, you want to see me prevail, you like my character, but he's cheating. He's a heel, and he's beating the out of me, and you feel bad for me, and you feel so bad for me that you want to see me get my payback. You want to see me overcome what this heel is doing to me. That is basic wrestling psychology 101. It doesn't get any more simple than that. And by the way, it's the exact premise. It's the foundation for every television series, every movie, every book, going back to the beginning of time. You have a hero, you have a villain. And it's the drama and the conflict that results from them competing against each other in wrestling that creates your interest. Well, if Paul is a babyface, if Paul is now Eric Bischoff and he's wrestling, he's in a program with Kenny McIntosh, and Paul's 7 foot tall and 450 pounds, and Kenny's 6'1" and 230 pounds, and Kenny beats Paul's ass and gets sympathy on him and cheats and hits him with crowbars and does all kinds of nasty to him. Is that believable to you? It's not. How do you get sympathy on a guy who is 7 foot tall and one of the strongest people literally on the face of the earth? So it's really tough to put Paul White in a babyface position. Conversely, if Paul White, the Giant, is a heel, he has to cheat to win. Why would a guy 7 foot tall and 400 pounds need to cheat to win? So there's a disconnect, and it's not always conscious, it's subconscious. Really good writing and crafting of characters and execution and acting and performing is very, very subtle. It's not always obvious. So you've got a guy who's 7 foot tall, which means he can't really be a good babyface because you can't get sympathy on him. You can't put him at a disadvantage. How the could he be at a disadvantage? He's wrestling guys and working with guys that are half his size. It doesn't make any sense. And if he's a heel, it doesn't make any sense that he'd have to cheat. And eventually he's going to get beat by the babyface. Well, how the could a 230-pound babyface beat a 450-pound monster? That doesn't work either. And I tried. We had all tried. Everybody tried to get Paul White over as a character. It didn't work. So when Paul came to me and said, "Hey, boss, I got $1 million a year upfront guarantee," I went, "Brother, you got to do what you got to do. And I fully support you and wish you the best."